Erinnern Sie sich, wenn Sie die erste Mal eine Stahlhelm gesehen hat?
Ja, machte mir schon Eindruck. Muss schon 1916 gewesen sein, dass wir das erste Mal sahen, nicht? Ja. Denn sie wurden ja erst eingeführt, als die Kopfschüsse sich ebenso sehr gemehrt hatten. Aber mein Stahlhelm, der wurde eben durchschossen. So, und es ging noch etwas durchstreifte noch den Kopf, habe ich noch die Wunde hier.
In welcher Art war es ein Eindruck, dass...
Naja, etwas an die Antike erinnern.
The militarism of the First World War that got carried into the Weimar Republic in Italy is probably one of the most important cultural events of the 20th and 21st century. It is often assumed that this war culture got carried over into the actual culture and led to the rise of fascism and every violence that happened during World War II. The problem with that perspective is that it often combines itself with a liberal view of brutalization and also adds a negative tonation to it. Propaganda pieces like All Quiet on the Western Front and most modern movies portray war as something 100% negative. This mindset led partwise to the current status quo, and can often lead to a misinterpretation if you apply this liberal mindset to an understanding of the past. The First War, in all its violence, meaninglessness and death count, was not, as many people like to assume, a horrid experience, but for a few men is the most important and greatest time of their life. Men like Ernst Jünger give an insight in either forgotten or purposefully ignored perspective on how war should be viewed. We will go into an understanding at what violence and war meant back then for some people, and why liberalism is so ashamed of violence and tries to ignore this way of thinking so much. The question of what war meant is one of the first misunderstandings of modern-day historical evaluation. If you attach meaning to war, this doesn't automatically mean that violence itself becomes more or less meaningful. Violence can have meaning disconnected from war and the other way around. It's important to note though that these can of course walk alongside of each other. Why this is essential to differentiate is in relation to the understanding of the actors of war. For many, war had great meaning. It was about nation, family and defense of what is one's own. In contrast to them, for some war itself was connected only very little to external meaning. It was a geopolitical conflict similar to the force of nature. It was a historical must that had to happen. So the meaning didn't come from a great picture of nationalism or politics, but from the personal rush of war. This opens a layer of analysis often ignored by modern historians. Their focus on the action itself and not the greater context makes war itself way more complicated to analyze. There was a personal idealization towards heroism, adventure and violence in war, but at the same time some kind of nihilism for the context of it. It's obvious that the normal soldier never intellectualized his thoughts this deeply. For the average soldier, such a deep self-reflection simply did not happen. I mean, look what we have diaries and interviews. The average soldier is not a philosopher, and exactly that's why books like Storms of Steel by Ernst Jünger are so absolutely essential. They give a very raw view into the thoughts of some people that were in World War I. But obviously this can't be generalized, and I'm not trying to do that here at all. For many, the exact opposite was the case. For many, war started with a metaphysical belief of nationalism, and the real war, the reality of war at least, was suppressed in the back of their head. And exactly these kind of people who thought war was 100% negative, had a horrible experience, this is the prominent picture we get of World War I, and that's what taught people about war nowadays. And exactly why liberalism tries so hard to focus on the negative aspects of war and the kind of all quiet in the Western Front kind of perspective. That's what I try to analyze here. Why this differentiation is so essential shows in the post-war time. The Weimar Republic was unstable and full of political turmoil. Basically every political group had a real chance at power. If every participant of the First World War would have seen war, violence and militarism as a horrid thing, then there wouldn't have been such an insane boost of the Freikorps. The Freikorps carried the militarism of the First World War into the Weimar Republic. The reason for this were various, but most of the time the men didn't want to surrender their feelings of camaraderie, leadership and meaning just because they lost the war. The Freikorps also continued to fight in many conflicts, in their own lands and in the Baltics. And even in the Baltics the barbarization continued. Even though most divisions followed their guidelines, many saw themselves as mercenaries and acted apart. They raided, looted, even though their pay was pretty good at the time. The Freikorps in the Baltics still give similar reasons like Jünger: radical history romanticism and a personal lust for adventure. In Germany the situation was more complex. At first glance it was an ideological conflict. The fear of Bolshevism and the revolution was the most prominent enemy of the Freikorps. The destruction of the Bavarian Revolution, the Spartacist uprising and the Litwitz Cup Putsch also show political direction. On the other hand, the ideological struggle can't be generalized. The Freikorps saw themselves as soldiers, not as politicians. Many didn't join for political reasons at all, how it is often idealized by modern-day fascists, but out of personal search of post-war meaning, adventure, and camaraderie, and the cleansing of the enemy was simply a part of that. And they also got paid really well, so that's also a nice bonus. The general fear of Bolshevism must be differentiated anyway. The Freikorps and other critics at the time of Bolshevism didn't hate the war itself or were opposed to the general economic structure, unless we're speaking about the actual bourgeois, but about the cultural elements that were carried along with it. For example, internationalism, hardcore progressivism, and the so-called quote-unquote fear of Jewish parts of the ideology. For evidence that I'm not just making this difference up, this difference was already apparent to the people back then. We can see this in the 1920s appearing ideology of National Bolshevism and Paul Elsbacher. Paul Elsbacher was a lifelong conservative, but advocated for a Bolshevist economy system, all the nice add-ons onto that, not just stressorism or some fake bullshit like that, but actual Bolshevism, with abolishment of private property, and he did it for a conservative audience. The exact elements that were seen as scary for the average person back then were removed. For example, internationalism was interpreted as a close alliance with the USSR and the Hungarian Socialist Republic, and it also states that Bolshevism rejects statelessness because of its impossibility. But it's not only one guy. Ernst Jünger was close friends with Ernst Niekisch, who was a famous national communist at the time. But the ideological struggle of the Freikorps didn't only go against left-wing revolutionaries, but had a general mentality of anti-democracy because they simply saw a system right in front of them wasn't working. So while the Freikorps were used by the state when needed, many Freikorps later joined the parties that made the Weimar Republic itself fall. And the Weimar Republic definitely wasn't left-wing, and they destroyed it very happily.
Ich habe gesagt, dass die deutsche Linke nie eine positive Kraft, das war nie eine Führung, war immer Opposition. Die Weimarer Republik war ja auch nicht links. Niekisch hatte eine sehr vernünftige Position, wurde aber natürlich dann durch die Nationalsozialisten eingesperrt und eigentlich physisch ist er nie wieder der Alte gewesen, als er wieder rauskam. Ein Wunder, dass sie nicht umgebracht haben.
I'm doing this part semi without a script because this topic is certainly more open to interpretation, and I think if I do it without a script I will get my point across better, so it will be more vague of course. Liberalism wants the anti-war view of World War I. It wants this all quiet in the Western Front, this crying soldier. They want all of this stuff because it doesn't want to admit that things like a lust for war and violence exist inside of us. Such a range of emotions simply is not allowed. It simply doesn't happen in liberalism. Liberalism shows this in much more ways than just how it treats war. We can see this in how liberalism punishes us. Of course, I'm taking some inspiration from Foucault here, but the point still stands. Liberalism does not touch your body unless it is absolutely forced to. Liberalism is very ashamed of violence, and even if liberalism does violence, for example, if it burns down an enemy, it comes home crying about it. It's disgusting. Liberalism will restrict you and punish you with monetary punishment, with punishment and reduction of freedoms, with actual movement restriction in prisons, but it does not behead you, it does not rip your guts out and throws it into the fire. That is not how liberalism works. Like stated in the accelerationism video, liberalism wants to sustain you just as much as it needs to, and so the spectrum in which you're allowed to operate in is very restricted. To make this absolutely clear, this is not something that happens by intention of a small group, for example. It's a side product of the goals. They don't realize they do this on purpose. Liberalism promotes things like individualism and humanism. Those are the goals that modern politicians follow, and then as a side product, the restriction of the emotional spectrum, for example, happens. People that tell you there's a small group doing this are retarded and you should disregard these people. It's a side product. They don't go into the little meetings and say we'll now reduce the emotional spectrum. They say we will follow humanism because they simply believe this is a good thing. I wouldn't say indoctrinated, because the starters of humanism actually thought it was a genuinely good idea, and it just kept promoting itself and so on and so on. Either way, while earlier there were, in older times, in feudal times, there were flies and wolves, we upgraded the average person's life to a standard of a sheep, but at the same time made the chance of becoming a wolf kinda impossible. Liberalism being the worst thing in your life is atrocious, because that such a weak and pathetic system is able to be the worst thing in your life shows the smallness of scale you are allowed to experience. Emotions should not only be valued in positive or negative, but also on their scale. While feeling love and very high happiness are usually seen as good, the lowest point is equally as important. In liberalism, there is no such thing as absolute sadness, anger or hate. You will never see your best friend's head getting blown off, you will never see your wife getting raped, and you will never see your son getting beheaded. While avoiding these things can be seen as an implicitly good thing, that is not the case. It leads to a loss of a big chunk of our emotional spectrum. Emotions should not be rated on good or bad, but by its scale. While capitalists, liberals and some Christians think that reducing the bad will lead to only the good existing, this is not the case. The good can only be identified by the bad, and the other way around. By reducing the scale of the bad, you also reduce the capability of the individual to the other direction. There can't be the highest feeling of joy if the worst state of contempt was never experienced. So for the average person, this is a positive development, because they will never experience the greatest joy anyway. No peasant will ever become Napoleon, so why should he care if suddenly the negative is being taken away from him? Why should they need to experience the greatest horrors? Why should they care about the wars being taken away from them? Most men considered World War I the worst time of their life. Few saw it as the greatest time of their lives, and saw and understood the greatness, disconnected from any ideological reasoning. And people that also recognize that also recognize the death of history. Jünger, Hitler, all these people kind of realize that. What are the consequences of that? Well, it leads to a complete misinterpretation of war, and I will show examples of this.
Also verherrlichen finde ich das gar nicht. Ich finde es von einer unfassbaren Kälte, von einer landsknechthaften Gleichgültigkeit, und er schildert das ohne jede Empathie. Und dieses Buch hier ist natürlich eine historisch-kritische Ausgabe mit Anmerkungen und allem und all den Fassungen. Das ist wirklich nur was für Spezialisten. Wer es wirklich lesen will, die Stahlgewitter, kann die 7. Fassung lesen, die ist, glaube ich, von 78, die letzte. Da kann man das lesen. Und dann begegnet man einem Menschen, der ja mit so einem adoleszenten Abenteuerdrang, völlig pubertär, in diesen Krieg rennt und beschreibt, was da passiert. Ob man das gerne liest, ist eine andere Frage. Ich lese das nicht gerne. Und vor allem ist er ja immer so geblieben. Noch 1997 hat er in 70 verweht geschrieben, ein alter Krieger zittert nicht. Also er ist schon sehr durchdrungen von diesem männlichen Geschlachte.
Er wurde ja im Krieg selber zum Käfersammler und hat sich ja für Panzerungen auch der Käfer und der Tanks und so interessiert. Es ist natürlich ein Buch...
Also ich finde es weniger verherrlichend als entsetzlich kalt.
Es ist eigentlich ein Buch, was auch eine sehr pazifistische Wirkung beim Leser haben kann, weil man eigentlich allein gelassen wird mit diesem Schrecken. Und
das Buch natürlich erreicht eine Abstumpfung, alle Körperöffnungen, alle Wunden, die die Leute haben, werden dann irgendwie gepanzert und man...
Bei mir nicht. Ich werde nicht abgestumpft. Es macht mich krank, es macht mich fertig, dieses Buch.
Kunst der Kälte von Ernst Jünger in Stadt.
I know these people are unbearable, and I hope you can forgive me that you had to witness that, but it proves very well what I'm trying to show. First, something I notice in general of people in this mindset, in this case. Liberals, and this humanist background, of course. I call this argumentative sociopathy. What I'm trying to describe with this is when our conclusion is so out of the spectrum for someone, in this case our circle of boomer book critics, that the only way that someone can reach that conclusion is if they are evil, mentally ill, or some other negative buzzwords they can throw at them. This is how a normal argument looks. I'm basically doing some logic philosophy here, has nothing to do with skeptics, it's just how you call this, argumentative reconstruction or whatever. Premise 1, I'm thirsty, P. Premise 2, when I'm thirsty I drink water, P to Q. Conclusion, I drink water, like just as a basic guide how argumentative reconstructions work. Now that we know how this works, we can apply this to our case very easily. Ernst Jünger thinks war is an important experience and not all that bad. Sociopaths, cold people, and horrid people think war is not all that bad and an important experience. Conclusion, Ernst Jünger is all the moral buzzwords you can throw at him. You probably noticed something pretty weird here, which is that the second premise seems a little bit out of place, it's just assumed. And you would be correct, if you think the second premise is weird, you're on the right track to what I'm arguing for. Let's do a second reconstruction to see this even clearer. War is always bad for the people in it. There are some people who didn't see war as bad. We now have something that we call a contradiction. We have P and negative P at the same time, and this cannot be the case. Something cannot be the case and not be the case at the same time. So, what do these people do? Usually when you have a contradiction, something must be wrong. So let's check the premises, what is wrong. Well, we know the second premise is true. There are some people who didn't see war as an implicitly bad thing. So, the first premise must now be wrong. So what they now do is a lot of mental gymnastics to uphold the first premise. But why? Liberalism is not made to deal with concepts such as war and what men feel during it. Modern politics are drenched in an empty feeling of human rights, human value, and normative ethics. The problem, if you try to apply such a mindset into an understanding of war and the past, it leads to mischaracterization and blacking out of some parts of it. If the representation of violence becomes one of self-sadness and self-loathing, about how horrid you feel when doing harm to your enemy, you create also a change in the modern times. The few men that don't fit into this picture don't come to existence anymore, and when they do, feel alienated and angry towards a system that doesn't address them. The past loses its face. The historical analysis becomes nothing but a reflection of the current time. Motivation stays misunderstood, and you get isolated in the now. If the past can't be understood, it becomes like fiction, and with fiction it loses its connection to reality. You can't look into the fake past neoliberalism offers you for advice, because it is fiction and was never real in the first place, so you can't get real advice from it. You become isolated and locked in the now, and the heroes that stormed trenches 100 years ago become as real as unicorns. What we need to understand is to break out of this infected mindset that neoliberalism forces onto you, and realize that the men 100 years ago were not much different from us, and the urge they felt is as real as the urges we feel nowadays, and liberalism restricting them is a sign that liberalism shouldn't exist.
Lasst wehen die schwarze Fahne, verschwunden ist die Nacht. Jetzt heißt es nun bei Zeiten zum Kampfe sich bereiten. Der Ritt geht nun zur Schlacht. Der Ritt geht nun zur Schlacht. Dort hält der Feind am Wall